Today, we bring you the story of the Enfield Poltergeist, one of the most terrifying and documented paranormal cases. In 1977, an ordinary family in London began to live a true nightmare. Mysterious sounds, objects moving on their own, and a dark presence that seemed to take over the house. In this video, we will dive into the events that shook the Hodgson family and puzzled even the most experienced investigators. Now, let's take a look at the house where it all began. House number 284 on Green Street, Enfield, seemed ordinary at first glance. It was a simple two-story building nestled between other terraced houses in the London suburb. However, this house would soon become the epicenter of one of the most disturbing hauntings in British history. In the late 1970s, Peggy Hodgson, a single mother, lived there with her 4 children. Life wasn't easy for Peggy. Raising 4 kids alone required constant effort, but she always did her best to keep the home stable. Janet, the eldest daughter, was 11 years old, active and curious, always looking after her younger siblings, especially Billy and Johnny. Family life was routine, full of laughter and small arguments, just like in any other home. Despite the difficulties, there was love in that family. Peggy did her best to keep everything under control, and although modest, the house was her refuge. The house, with its small rooms and old furniture, seemed safe. The red brick exterior and the windows overlooking the tree-lined street in Enfield gave a sense of tranquility. The children spent their days playing in the backyard or on the sidewalks, while Peggy organized the house or took care of shopping. But this ordinary appearance hid what was about to happen. The Hodgson family's daily life would soon be drastically interrupted by inexplicable and terrifying events. Something was about to change, something no one expected. For months, the family had led a quiet life, with no concerns beyond finances or the normal challenges of family life. But as autumn progressed, small details began to catch attention. Occasional sounds and knocks on the walls were initially attributed to the house's old structure, or even the wind whistling through the neighborhood. However, no one imagined that these sounds were just the prelude to something much darker. It all began subtly, almost imperceptibly. The knocks on the walls, initially sparse, soon became more frequent. The sound, which was once muffled and could be ignored, started to reverberate through the house in a disturbing way, as if someone was inside the walls trying to get out. On that September night, Peggy was already accustomed to hearing the noises while trying to sleep. As a mother, her sleep was always light, and any strange sound would wake her. But this time, the noise was different. It was more insistent, more unsettling. At first, she thought it was one of the children walking around the house or moving in their beds. She got up slowly, adjusted her robe, and walked down the hallway to the children's room. She expected to find Janet or Johnny out of bed, but to her surprise, they were all sound asleep. She tried to calm the unease in her mind, returning to her own room and convincing herself that the sounds were just the old wooden beams creaking because of the wind. But as soon as she lay down, the knocks returned, this time louder and followed by something even more terrifying, the sound of furniture being dragged. Peggy quickly got up, her heart racing. She walked through the dark house, feeling her way through the furniture until she turned on the living room lights. Nothing seemed out of place. However, her maternal instinct told her that something was very wrong. When she reached Janet's room, the real horror began. Janet's bed was moving. Slowly, the heavy wooden bed seemed to slide across the floor as if an invisible force was pushing it. Janet, still half asleep, began to moan and turn, unaware of what was happening. Panic took over Peggy. She ran to her daughter's bed, holding it tightly, trying to steady it. "Janet, wake up," she whispered, almost without a voice. Janet woke up startled, looking around. "What's going on?" she asked, confused. Peggy tried to stay calm, although fear was written all over her face. "It was just a bad dream, dear," she said, not believing her own words for a second. "Go back to sleep." That night, the knock stopped for a moment, but Peggy couldn't close her eyes. The fear that something bigger was yet to come kept her on high alert. Even after Janet fell back asleep, Peggy sat on the edge of the bed, watching her daughter, and wondering what could be causing those phenomena. In the days that followed, the strange events intensified. Cups and utensils in the kitchen began moving on their own, without anyone touching them. Doors that had been closed suddenly slammed open, as if they were being pushed. The children started to notice, and although scared, they tried to joke about it to lighten the mood, thinking that maybe it was just playful ghosts. But Peggy knew something much more sinister was happening. She began to fear for her family's safety, not realizing that those early signs were only the beginning of a true escalation of terror. What began as small knocks and slowly moving objects evolved into something much more disturbing. In the following weeks, the house in Enfield seemed to be dominated by an invisible and inexplicable force. Peggy watched helplessly as the events became increasingly intense and frightening. What were once minor anomalies now took terrifying proportions, and fear began to consume the Hodgson family. Everything seemed to center around Janet, the eldest daughter. She began to complain about a strange presence in her room at night. Initially, Peggy thought it was just her imagination, the result of nightmares caused by the stress of the supernatural activities. But then, one night, something much darker happened. Janet was in the living room with her mother and siblings, trying to watch television, when suddenly, the chair she was sitting in was violently pushed across the room. The noise was deafening, and the impact left everyone in shock. Janet screamed in fear as Peggy rushed to her, not knowing what to do. The chair, which was heavy and made of solid wood, could not have moved on its own with such force. "It was him. It was the man who lives here," Janet cried, terrified. The girl's words echoed through the room, leaving a heavy silence in the air. Peggy, despite the terror she felt, tried to calm her daughter. "Who is he, Janet? Who are you seeing?" she asked, but Janet just shook her head, unable to explain. In the following days, things got even worse. The house seemed to have a life of its own, as if an invisible presence was taking complete control. Heavy furniture began to float without explanation, doors slammed violently, and objects were thrown across rooms. It was as if the house was under attack. However, what disturbed Peggy the most was Janet's behavior. The girl, who had once been energetic and cheerful, began to grow increasingly withdrawn and troubled. Sometimes she seemed to completely disconnect, staring into space for minutes, as if in a trance. But what happened next was even more frightening. One morning, Peggy heard voices coming from Janet's room. At first, she thought it was her daughter talking with her siblings, but as she approached, she realized the voices were coming from Janet, and they were completely different. Upon opening the door, she found her daughter sitting on the bed, speaking in a deep, raspy voice that didn't sound human. It was impossible for such a disturbing voice to come from an 11-year-old girl. Peggy was paralyzed with fear. "Janet," she called, but the girl didn't respond. She continued murmuring incomprehensible words in a dark tone, her expression blank and distant. When she finally came to, Janet remembered nothing. She was confused and frightened, unaware of what had happened. The phenomena didn't stop there. Soon, things began happening in front of witnesses. Neighbors and friends who visited the house started to witness the inexplicable events, reinforcing the idea that something evil was happening there. The police were called on one occasion, and even the officers reported seeing a chair move on its own without anyone touching it. The case became a mystery for everyone, and the house gained a reputation in the neighborhood as haunted. As fear grew, the family began living in a constant state of alert. The nights were the worst. Janet's sleep was frequently interrupted by screams of terror, and she said something was pulling her out of bed. The lights flickered incessantly, and the knocks on the walls continued, louder and more insistent. Peggy was on the verge of despair. She knew this was not something she could handle alone, but she didn't know where to turn. Her family was being tormented by something invisible and violent, and what once seemed improbable was now undeniable. There was a supernatural force in the house. That's when Peggy made a decision. She needed help, not from an electrician or carpenter, but from someone who understood what was happening, someone who could deal with the supernatural. She didn't know that this decision would bring investigators to her house who would change their lives forever. Desperate and unsure of what else to do, Peggy decided to seek help. She had heard of similar cases where inexplicable phenomena had been investigated by specialists. So, she contacted the Society for Psychical Research, which quickly sent two experienced investigators to look into the events: Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair. Maurice Gross was a veteran investigator who had been involved in several cases of paranormal activity. Though naturally skeptical, he was accustomed to dealing with supernatural reports, and when he heard Peggy's story, something caught his attention. He didn't expect the Enfield case to become one of the most intense of his career. By Morris's side was Guy Lyon Playfair, another researcher in the field, known for his studies on poltergeists and unusual phenomena. The two arrived at Peggy's house on a cold November afternoon, ready to begin their investigation. The family welcomed them with relief, hoping that, somehow, these men could put an end to the nightmare they were living. The first thing the investigators noticed was the heavy atmosphere in the house. Maurice later described that the air seemed thick, as if something invisible surrounded them. It wasn't just the physical environment, but an oppressive feeling, a kind of uncontrollable tension that he couldn't ignore. Peggy detailed all the phenomena, from the knocks on the walls to Janet's disturbing behavior. Maurice and Guy began investigating the rooms, looking for signs of paranormal activity. On the very first night, they witnessed something that left them stunned. One of the chairs in the living room moved abruptly, with no one nearby. It was a brief moment, but enough to shake the rational views of both men. In the days that followed, the investigators documented numerous inexplicable events. Maurice set up recorders throughout the house, hoping to capture sounds or voices that could provide some clue as to what was happening. To his astonishment, one of the recordings captured a deep, guttural voice saying incomprehensible things. There was no doubt that something or someone was trying to communicate, and this entity seemed to be using Janet as a channel. In addition to the recorders, cameras were installed in strategic points, hoping to capture physical activities. Objects moved right in front of the investigators' eyes. Cushions were thrown into the air, and doors slammed forcefully. Janet continued to exhibit strange behavior, frequently entering a trance and speaking in voices that were not her own. Maurice and Guy knew they were dealing with something far more serious than a simple hoax or a child's imagination. The evidence kept piling up, and with each passing day, the case became more intense and dangerous. As the days went by, the atmosphere in the Enfield house became unbearable. Maurice and Guy witnessed paranormal activity daily, but nothing could prepare them for what was about to happen. The house seemed to have been taken over by a malevolent force that grew stronger every day, especially around Janet. One of the most terrifying nights began like any other. The family was gathered in the living room, with Maurice and Guy present, all exhausted and emotionally drained by weeks of strange events. Suddenly, the lights began to flicker, and an intense cold swept through the room. Without warning, a series of violent knocks echoed through the house's walls, as if someone was hammering the walls with force. "Do you hear that?" Peggy whispered, clutching her children's hands tightly. Maurice, always skeptical, approached the wall from where the sound was coming. He pressed his ear against it, trying to identify the source. But before he could say anything, a chair was violently thrown across the room. Janet screamed, and chaos erupted. Janet, who had seemed scared until then, was thrown from her chair as if an invisible force had pushed her. She fell hard to the floor, but before anyone could react, something even stranger happened. Her body began to levitate. Maurice and Guy froze, unable to believe what they were seeing. Janet was floating a few inches above the ground, her arms rigid by her sides, while her eyes rolled back. Her mother, in complete despair, rushed to try to grab her, but was stopped by something invisible, as if a barrier prevented her from touching her daughter. "Janet, listen to me," Peggy shouted, desperate. But Janet didn't respond. The young girl floated, as if in the grip of something too powerful to be controlled. Her body was tossed from side to side like a rag doll. The situation seemed unbearable. The knocks on the walls grew louder. The furniture moved on its own, and everyone present was engulfed in growing panic. Then, in the midst of the chaos, Janet began to speak, but the voice that came from her was not hers. It was a deep, guttural, masculine voice. Something evil was manifesting through her. "I am Bill Wilkins," the voice from Janet said. "I died in this house. I suffered here." The room fell into complete silence. The voice that echoed through the room was cold, distant, filled with pain and anger. Maurice, holding the camera, tried to film what was happening, but his hands were shaking so much he could barely hold the equipment. Still, he knew they were witnessing something they had never seen before. "Who are you?" Maurice asked, trying to keep his composure. The voice responded, repeating the same thing like a mantra. "I am Bill Wilkins. I died in this house. I suffered a lot." Janet, or rather, the entity speaking through her, didn't seem to want to stop. She repeated the man's story, his death, and his suffering in a frightening, emotionless tone. The name Bill Wilkins, previously unknown to the family, seemed to resonate in every corner of the house, as if the very structure was reacting to the presence of this spirit. Maurice, still in shock, made a mental note to investigate the story of this Bill Wilkins. Could he be real? Did the name mean anything? Morris's natural skepticism was disintegrating before his own eyes. Even with years of experience investigating paranormal activity, he had never witnessed anything so extreme. Meanwhile, Janet's voice finally ceased, and her body fell to the floor with a thud. Peggy rushed to hold her daughter, who was now unconscious. The feeling in the room was one of pure exhaustion, as if everyone had faced something beyond human comprehension. That night marked the peak of the paranormal phenomena in the Enfield house. Although the strange events continued, the manifestation of that entity speaking through Janet left everyone with a deep sense of fear and helplessness. Something terrible had happened in that house, and it seemed that the spirit was not willing to leave anytime soon. After the night when Janet was possessed by the voice of Bill Wilkins, the tension in the Enfield house reached unbearable levels. Every day, the family lived in fear of what might happen. The simple act of sleeping had become impossible for Peggy and her children, who spent their nights in constant vigilance, alert to any signs of disturbance. For Janet, however, the situation was even worse. She was the epicenter of all the activity and was visibly deteriorating, both physically and emotionally. Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair continued their investigations in the house. They set up more cameras and recorders in different spots, trying to capture irrefutable evidence of paranormal activity. However, the manifestations did not follow predictable schedules or patterns. It was as if the entity knew when it was being observed and deliberately avoided manifesting during the most important recordings. Even so, the two investigators were determined to learn more about the spirit that seemed to haunt the Hodgson family. Maurice began researching the name Bill Wilkins, and to his surprise, he discovered that there really had been a man by that name who had lived in the house years before and died there. Bill Wilkins was an elderly man who had passed away from a brain hemorrhage while sitting in a chair in the living room, the same room where many of the most violent phenomena occurred. This discovery reinforced Maurice and Guy's belief that they were not dealing with hallucinations or an elaborate hoax. There was a direct connection between the spirit that was manifesting and the house's history. However, understanding this link didn't bring relief to the family. It only heightened their fear. Knowing that the spirit of Bill Wilkins, or something pretending to be him, was tormenting Janet and controlling her actions, left everyone on the brink of despair. The paranormal events continued. Objects flew across the room without warning. Knocks and scratches on the walls were heard every night, and Janet still fell into trances, speaking in strange voices. Maurice and Guy knew they needed more help. They consulted other paranormal experts, hoping that someone could offer a definitive solution to the case. The psychological and emotional battle was wearing everyone down. Maurice, although fascinated by the case, also began to feel the weight of the phenomena. He was witnessing firsthand the devastating impact the poltergeist was having on the Hodgson family. Peggy was increasingly tired, fearing for her children's safety and her own sanity. Janet, on the other hand, seemed more vulnerable with each passing day, as if the entity was draining her energy. Despite all the documentation, the evidence collected, and the involvement of various experts, there was no clear solution in sight. It was as if the house itself was determined to hold onto the spirit's presence, refusing to allow any peace for those living there. As the months went by, the paranormal events began to decrease in intensity. The poltergeist that had terrorized the Hodgson family for so long seemed to be losing strength, but the calm that settled in the house was not immediately met with relief. Peggy and the children, though relieved by the reduction in activity, were still deeply scarred by the traumatic events. Janet, the one most affected by everything that had occurred, began to show signs of recovery. She no longer fell into trances as frequently, and the mysterious voices that once came from her mouth became increasingly rare. Still, the young girl didn't feel free. The presence that had tormented her seemed to always be lurking, like a shadow that, although less active, never completely disappeared. Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair continued to monitor the house, although they too noticed the decline in the intensity of the phenomena. They still recorded strange sounds and occasionally witnessed objects moving on their own, but nothing compared to the violence they had seen in the early months. It was as if Bill Wilkins' spirit had found some kind of satisfaction, or perhaps was losing interest in tormenting the family. Even with the reduction in phenomena, life in the house was never the same. Janet and her siblings began to sleep in the same room, afraid to be alone. Peggy, who had always been strong and determined, was now exhausted and emotionally fragile. The house, which had once been a family refuge, had become a place of fear and distrust, where every noise or movement was watched with caution. Eventually, the family considered moving, but Peggy's financial limitations made that impossible in the short term. The lack of a definitive solution to what had happened in their home kept everyone on edge. The reduction in paranormal activity didn't bring complete relief, only an uncertain truce. Although the investigators remained intrigued by what they had witnessed, they knew that the Enfield case didn't have a clear resolution. Bill Wilkins' spirit might still be present in silence, waiting for the right moment to manifest again. Years have passed since the events in Enfield came to an end, but the scars left on the Hodgson family and the people involved remain deep. The story of the Enfield Poltergeist became one of the most documented and debated paranormal cases in modern history. Janet Hodgson's name was still remembered, and the memories of those terrifying nights remained vivid both for the family and for the investigators. Janet, now an adult, gave several interviews over the years, recounting her memories and feelings about what she had experienced. Although some parts of the events became hazy in her mind, others still haunted her. In an interview given years later, Janet stated that she felt as though she had never completely rid herself of the entity that took over her life during those months of torment. "Sometimes I still feel the presence," she confessed. "Not like before, but it's as if something is always there watching." For Maurice Grosse, the Enfield case was more than just work. He became deeply involved with the Hodgson family and even became an emotional protector for Janet during the most difficult moments. Maurice continued investigating paranormal phenomena until the end of his life, but he never stopped considering the Enfield Poltergeist as one of the most disturbing cases he had ever faced. In his records, he described the frustration of not having found a clear solution, although he knew that what he witnessed was real. Guy Lyon Playfair, on the other hand, wrote a book about the case titled "This House is Haunted," in which he detailed the investigations and his conclusions. In his work, he emphasized that despite the doubts of many, the events that took place in Enfield could not be explained merely as hoaxes or illusions. There was something more in the house, something that didn't fit within the natural laws we know. Even so, the case has always been a target of skepticism. Many critics suggested that the events were fabricated or exaggerated by the family, mainly by Janet. However, the large number of witnesses, including neighbors, police officers, and the investigators themselves, made it difficult to completely dismiss the phenomena as a hoax. To this day, the debate about the veracity of the Enfield events continues, with some considering it one of the most convincing pieces of evidence of paranormal activity, while others remain doubtful. The emotional impact on the Hodgson family, however, was undeniable. Janet, her siblings, and her mother, Peggy, never fully returned to normalcy. The house where everything happened still exists, but for the family, that place was no longer a home. Eventually, Peggy moved with her children, seeking a new life far from the memories that haunted them. The move brought some relief, but the experiences in Enfield would never be forgotten. The Enfield Poltergeist remains a legend, a mystery without definitive answers. And for Janet, there may never be real closure. "Sometimes I wonder if all of it was real," she said in one of her last interviews. "But deep down, I know that what we lived through was all too real. And that's something that never goes away." The story of the Enfield house lives on through accounts and records, intriguing both skeptics and believers alike. What happened there may never be fully understood, but it continues to be one of the most chilling and exciting cases in modern paranormal history.